Born on October 16th, 1997, Charles Leclerc was the second oldest of three brothers, and while being raised in Monaco, you think of the casino, the billionaires that go there to evade their taxes. There are still small villages in Monaco where the natives live, which is where Charles Leclerc grew up. He grew up in a neighborhood called La Côte, which is what it would be their blue collar working neighborhood, even though Monaco doesn't really have blue collar working neighborhoods, given it is also a 2x4. His father, Hervé, an ex Formula 3 driver, and mother, Pascal, who still to this day owns a hair salon in Monaco, were not what would be the wealthiest of the wealthiest in Monaco. Yes, they had money. Anyone who lives in Monaco has money, and anyone who gets into karting has some form of money. But growing up a billionaire was not something that Charles Leclerc did. And something that may surprise you about the natives in Monaco is that they're not actually allowed to go into the Monaco casino, as there was a law put in place so that they would avoid any gambling addiction. So, unless giving special permission, Charles Leclerc is not technically allowed to enter the casino in Monaco. Now, I've seen a few videos on here of people breaking down Charles Leclerc's rookie season and even his rise into Formula One. What I want to do with this video is go over Charles Leclerc's entire history into karting and his 6 years in Formula One as a whole. One day, at the age of 4, feigning illness, Charles Leclerc convinced his father that he did not have to go to school that day because he was sick and instead should follow him down to the racing track where he would then meet the Bianchis. Of course, Charles' father, believing him, because why would Charles lie about being sick, took him to the racetrack, and it was then that Charles Leclerc entered his first kart. Ever since that day, Charles became hooked with karting, even citing the fact that he was so fast was because he did not know what the brake pedal was. And honestly, looking back at some of his older races, you can definitely see that in him. In 2005, Charles Leclerc would start his actual karting career, entering the French PACA championship and winning it straight away, and winning the following championship a year later in 2006, not winning the 2007, but winning again in 2008. In 2009, he became the youngest French championship winner in cadet. In 2010, the winner of the Monaco Cup kart in KF3. And in 2011, the youngest winner of the CIK FIA KF3 World Cup winner and the winner of the Academy Trophy. In 2012, Charles Leclerc was a CIK FIA World Championship. He was the U18 Vice European Champion in CIK FIA KF2 and the youngest champion in the WSK Series KF2. 2013 would see Charles Leclerc's last season in karting, where he would finish second in the CIK FIA KZ World Cup, where he lost to, you guessed it, Max Verstappen, and the youngest winner of the Winter Cup KZ. However, Charles Leclerc's karting career was not all sunshine and rainbows. At the age of 14, it was rumored that Charles Leclerc was going to have to quit the sport as the financial burden was going to be too much on the family, with both him and Arthur, his younger brother, trying to be into karting. It's just too much of a financial burden for one family to carry. That was when Jules Bianchi, his godfather, stepped in, introducing him to Nicholas Todd, who is now Charles Leclerc's manager. Nicholas Todd was not able to gain Charles' sponsorships, but also personally backed and invested in Charles himself. If you were following the 2024 season, you might remember this one.
His career was finished without the intervention of the late Jules Bianchi, who said to Ferrari, "You've got to take this guy. You've got to make sure that he gets to Formula One." And what a gift that was to give.
One time when he was young, Charles Leclerc took place in a 24-hour race with his older brother Lorenzo, Jules Bianchi, and their friend Nato. And around 3 a.m., they woke Charles up and were like, "Hey, can you get in the car for an hour? We want to go party." So Charles Leclerc hops his little booty into that cart, and for 5 hours, they forget about him. But Charles Leclerc is like, "I'm leading this race. I'm not pulling aside to give up the win," and instead drives around for 5 hours in the cold, not knowing when anybody's going to come to save him. And at 8 a.m., they finally come to rescue him. And are like, sorry, lost track of time. 2014 saw the start to Charles Leclerc's single-seater career, joining Formula Renault Alps against Nick de Vries, who was going to enter his third year in this championship and was likely to be the champion. Charles Leclerc ended up finishing second in this year and was battling against Nick for most of the year. He had 2 DNFs in the first 2 races, which definitely did not help his case, and was second place in the third race, but he did win both races at Monza. 2015 would see Charles Leclerc move up to Formula 3, and this is not the Formula 3 we know now, where it follows Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1. Formula 3 was actually a little bit lower at this point, and it wasn't until 2019 when the version of Formula 3 as we know it now was introduced. He ended up finishing 4th this season and won the best rookie that year. He was with VAR Racing, who I wonder who recommended him for that seat, it surely couldn't have been his lifelong rival Max Verstappen, who had raced for them in the previous year. Couldn't have been. And a fun fact about Max apparently recommending this seat for Charles is that the old team principal of this team claimed them to be the next Senna and Prost. There was a lot of familiar faces in Formula 3 this season. Lance Stroll, George Russell, Alex Albon were also all racing in this year, and Lance Stroll actually ended up winning. His daddy was really paying for the best technology at this point. Things were actually looking great for the beginning of the Formula 3 series for Charles. He had 12 podiums in just the first 15 races and was leading the championship. But as the season went on, development really fell behind for them. And then he had a crash with Lance that ended up to him having a damaged chassis for a few races, which ended up being fixed. But because they were already so high in development, it didn't really matter at that point. He did have a phenomenal last race in Monaco, which is very similar to Monaco, if you don't know. Great overtaking there. He didn't end up winning, but it really caught a lot of people's attention. In 2016, we saw Charles Leclerc take another step up to GP3, which is more similar to the F3 that we know now, where he ended up being crowned champion, and he was racing with ART Grand Prix. Alex Albon and Nick De Vries were also two of his teammates for this season, and him and Alex were in a title fight for most of the year. It ended up coming down to the last race where they actually ended up both crashing out, so because Charles Leclerc was ahead, he ended up winning the championship anyway. And this year, he was a development driver for Haas, and he was signed to the Ferrari Driver Academy. 2016, we would also see Charles Leclerc get his first glimpse at what driving a Ferrari was like when he did the 2016 Silverstone test for them. Another year and another step up, 2017 saw Charles Leclerc entering Formula 2, which is the first year of Formula 2 as we know it today. To say Charles Leclerc outclassed the field in this season feels like an understatement. He won 5 races pre-summer break and 2 post-summer break and won the championship in the penultimate race. And if there is one race I am begging you to watch from this season, please go watch Charles Leclerc's F2 sprint in Bahrain. Simply a masterclass. On lap 15 of 23, Charles Leclerc comes in to pit for new tires. Who does a pit stop during the middle of a sprint race? Seems crazy, right? Because of this pit stop, we see him come out in 11th place, and he now has 8 laps to try and overtake 11 cars for the win of this race. And that is exactly what he does. There was no stopping him. Turn after turn, Charles Leclerc was just picking through them. Brilliant. Please go watch it. And while this year did see a lot of success for Charles Leclerc, it was also the start of what became the Monaco curse. After the restart during a pit stop, an upright suspension part broke on his left front wheel, causing him to have to end his race early, thus being the first year that Charles Leclerc would not finish the Monaco Grand Prix, something we would see continue to happen for the next few years. And this was not the first of tragedies we would see for Charles Leclerc in his Formula 2 season. Unfortunately, during the Baku race weekend, Charles Leclerc lost his father, and he would come back that same weekend to win the race, dedicating everything to his father. Honestly, it's a story that breaks me down every time. Just the strength and resilience that it would take to go to that weekend, to give it your all, to know that it's what your father would want you to do, but also knowing the fact later that you had just lied to your father. Because as it would come out, Charles Leclerc told his father that he had already signed for his F1 seat. He'd signed the contract, he'd signed the dotted line. This was not true. And he got yelled at by his mom for this. But again, if you have been following the 2024 season, as you may recall,
in 2017, Charles Leclerc lost his father, and in his final days, he told his father a white lie, that he'd made it to Formula 1, that he'd signed the contract. It wasn't true then, but his driving has made it true now.
And yes, I am telling the story of Charles Leclerc through the Monaco Grand Prix commentary. It's perfect. It sums up his career in a short minute for me. In the end, Charles Leclerc ended up winning the F2 championship by 72 points and finishing nearly 200 points ahead of his teammate. This year, Charles Leclerc was also the Alfa Romeo reserve driver, so we saw him enter a few F1 practice sessions and did another tire test for Ferrari where he actually topped the timing sheets. Charles Leclerc's lie to his father obviously did not last very long, and in 2018 we did see him join the F1 grid with Alfa Romeo with Marcus Ericsson as his teammate. A quick little fun fact before we actually break down his 2018 season, the team principals actually rate the drivers at the end of every season and give their list out, and in 2018 Charles Leclerc was ranked the 6th best driver on the grid in an Alfa Romeo. And to put that into context, he finished above Raikkonen, Bottas, Ocon, and Hulkenberg. But anyways, on to the 2018 season. Charles Leclerc, being the rookie on his team, obviously feels the need to prove himself, and prove himself he did. He ended up taking 81% of the team's points, finishing with 39 points ahead of Marcus Ericsson's 9 points, and scoring points in over half the races he ended up finishing. This season also gave us a glimpse into his true qualifying magic, making 10 Q3 appearances in a car that ended up finishing only 8th in the championship. One place where we really got to see this qualifying pace shine for Charles was Baku. Of course, the Baku specialist is going to do magical things in Baku, but he had nearly 2 seconds on his teammate in qualifying, making it to Q3 and finished 6th for his first points of the season. 6th. Given the 2018 Baku race, but that was the race that Max and Danny crashed into each other. There was a lot going on in that race, so he definitely got a helping hand due to some luck, but 6th in a Sauber. We then saw him get points again in Spain, taking a 10th place, but soon after came Monaco. And boy, I wonder what could go wrong in Monaco. After having a few good overtakes, Charles Leclerc unfortunately had brake failure, so he ended up crashing out of the race. With 2 more 10ths in Canada and France and a 9th in Austria, the hype around this man was truly growing. We heard it from Seb, and there were even Mercedes rumors going around that he would go there since both Lewis and Bottas' contracts were up at the end of the year. However, he then faced a string of bad luck in the following few races where they forgot to properly attach his wheel in Silverstone, so not a great time for us. And then 2 back-to-back crashes, which were not his fault. And wouldn't it be crazy if one of them was so bad that in the first year the Halo got introduced, we got to see why it was actually very necessary for the Halo to be introduced despite all of its criticisms? That would be crazy. But alas, on September 11th, 2018, Charles was announced as a Ferrari driver for the next season and would swap places with Kimi Raikkonen. And little to say, the people were not happy. The Tifosi, not happy about this. They wanted a more experienced driver, okay? You don't go to Ferrari unless you are an experienced driver. Why are they taking this newbie, this rookie, this person who has not yet to prove himself as a full season in Formula One? That would die down in the next year, but the crowds were not happy. Another reason why this decision was so controversial, because in 2018, Ferrari's CEO of the time passed away, and he was the one really championing Charles for this car. He wanted Charles in that car, and it was rumored that he had signed a contract with Charles before he ended up passing, but nobody knew what was going to go on after that, and they kind of wanted to keep the Seb and Kimi dynamic as it was a known, and entering this new era with such a great big unknown didn't feel like the right choice. But did Charles Leclerc let this backlash get to him? No. In the last 7 races of the season, Charles Leclerc finished in the points in 5 of them, and in 4 of them finishing 7th. Because of his amazing season, Charles Leclerc ended up winning the FIA Rookie of the Year that year. And let me just put into perspective, Charles Leclerc was 11-3 head-to-head on the race with Marcus Ericsson, and 17-4 on a quali head-to-head with Mark Ericsson. Phenomenal numbers. 2019 would see Charles Leclerc's first year in red alongside 4-time world champion teammate Sebastian Vettel. The opening race in Australia was nothing spectacular for Charles. He would start 5th and finish 5th, but by the second race in Bahrain was when we really saw Charles Leclerc shine. In Bahrain, Charles Leclerc would start on pole and was set for a clear win, being the fastest car on the grid, and it was only until an engine misfire caused his places to drop significantly, and the only thing that caused him to not leave the podium was due to a late safety car, so he ended up finishing the race P3 instead of P1.
There's something strange with the engine.
Okay, copy that, we are checking it.
There's something strange with the engine. What's happening?
Leclerc is a sitting duck.
Guys, that was extremely unfortunate for Charles. He drove such a great race.
After this race, we saw a lot of praise from both Lewis and Seb. This was the iconic Seb cradling Charles' face photo. I mean, it says enough. A picture says 1,000 words, and that one speaks to me in ways that it doesn't. And even Lewis, after the race, saying that he was something special and he had so many race wins ahead of him.
You drove great this weekend,
Yeah.
You really drove fantastic.
Good.
Yeah.
It's all falling.
And then there's a long, long future ahead of you, so.
Also.
No, it sucks in this moment, but you've got a long, long way to go, so thank you so much.
His season started to fall back again after this. In the Chinese GP, he would start 4th, but finish 5th due to team orders that would allow Seb to go ahead. In Baku, we got the iconic "I am stupid" radio message, which came after a late crash in Q3, causing him to have to start 10th for the race. He ended up being pushed up to P8 due to 2 cars taking penalties, and he would finish the race in P5. Again, in the Spanish Grand Prix, he would start the race 5th and finish 5th, and the Monaco Grand Prix saw too even more disaster. I mean, the issue started with Ferrari on Saturday. They kept him in the garage after his first lap in Q1, meaning he did not get to improve on his time and ended up going out in Q1, and to try and make up for it during the race, making some great overtakes before trying to overtake Nico Hulkenberg, but was way too close to the inside. He ended up puncturing his right rear tire, and on his 3-wheel lap back to the pits, destroyed his floor, ultimately leading to his DNF. Ugh, another year, another Monaco DNF. In Canada, we would see him start and finish 3rd. He really was not able to keep up with Seb and Lewis's pace, but should have probably finished ahead of Seb if Ferrari had told Charles about the penalty that Seb was occurring, but I don't even think Charles Leclerc had at that point because he was too busy defending Seb, and why Seb should have won the race. French Grand Prix would again see him start and finish 3rd. He had some battles with Max, but really just maximized results for this race. Now we get to the Austrian Grand Prix. Max Verstappen, you will pay for your crimes some way, somehow. Just know I always have my eye out, and I am ready to strike at any given moment. Charles Leclerc, starting on pole, had the pace to go and win this race. This was also helped by the fact that Max had a pretty bad start to the race, but during the end, now on fresher tires than Charles, Max was really making a charge up to the front. And in the last lap of the race, saw Max push Charles off the track, leading to him overtaking Charles and him finishing ahead by half a second. Little to say, Charles Leclerc is not happy about this event at all. He wants Max penalized. He's telling everyone he can see around him that Max Verstappen deserves a penalty. He's storming around. He's angry in the cool down room. He's marching off that podium. He doesn't give a fuck about a celebration. He's getting out of there. He's pissed off. Max Verstappen, on the other hand, is going around giving interviews about how him and Charles are fine and they're going to be racing each other for 10 to 15 years and that they're actually hopping on a flight together after this. Yeah, that's right. They're flying home together. They had to sit in close quarters with each other, and Charles Leclerc looks about ready to rip this man's head off. But instead of ripping his head off, what does he do? He unfollows him on Instagram. That's the type of petty king that I support, Charles Leclerc. Stand by it. Max Verstappen proceeds to then unfollow him as well. Ends to where we are today. If you want to know more about all of this, go watch my previous video, which is the entire breakdown of their history together, because it is chef's kiss. The following race in Silverstone, we did see Charles make Max pay for what happened in Austria with one of the best battles of the year and Max Verstappen's favorite battle of the year. I mean, truly watching them fight corner and corner, the prophecy of it all. Like, I need a title fight between them so bad. Charles was great, literally pulling the same moves that Max Verstappen had made on him in the previous race, and Charles ended up in 3rd with Max in 5th as we had a collision with Seb, so we all know who won that battle. The German Grand Prix saw issues with Charles' car in Q3, causing him to start P10, and then finding a wet patch during the race caused him to spin off and retire. So, in Hungary, Charles started 4th and finished 4th. Ferrari did a pretty bold strategy with Seb, and Seb ended up jumping him in the race to get 3rd. Spa saw another weekend of tragedy for Charles, but not due to his on-track performance, but what happened during F2 that weekend. Unfortunately, during the F2 feature race, Antoine Hubert crashed, ended up getting hit by another car, ultimately ending his life. And Antoine was very close friends with a lot of the younger drivers because he was so close to them in age, and he was specifically close with the likes of Charles Leclerc and Pierre Gasly. Charles ended up outclassifying the field in both qualifying and the race. There was a sort of fight going on with Lewis, but it ultimately ended up that it was going to be Charles' win. But it would never be seen, obviously, as Charles' first win. You know, it was always going to get overshadowed by what happened that weekend. Celebrations were really low, but we really got to see and got a glimpse of what Charles could do. Moving on to Monza, the celebrations would come in this race, getting a pole position in Monza, causing a controversy because he did not give Seb a slipstream in the final qualifying as promised. Seb then made a mistake during the race, leaving Charles very vulnerable to the Mercedes. But as we know, Mercedes do everything at him today. Charles Leclerc has coped brilliantly. He's got one more corner, the famous Parabolica, to go. He won in Spa, he wins in Monza. Charles Leclerc is the winner of the 2019 Italian Grand Prix. There were some controversial moves with Lewis during the race, and you can go back and look at them. They both are going off the track. No penalties received, though. Some fans were unhappy. So this race did cement Charles Leclerc in the history of Ferrari, though, and did get a lot of the Ferrari fans who were initially not Team Charles Leclerc to become Team Charles Leclerc. Like, he literally won Monza for them. What more can they want? Hey, so editing Sammy popping on here because I somehow forgot to mention Singapore 2019, which was arguably the second most controversial race behind Brazil this year, because it should have been Charles Leclerc's third win in a row. But after the controversy that was the Monza qualifying, and after Charles was leading the race, he got undercut by Seb without his team telling him, relegating Charles second. So the rest of the season would see Charles Leclerc up a few more pole positions, the next one being in Russia, where he would end up finishing the race in third due to an unlucky yellow flag that allowed the Mercedes to get a free pit stop and stay ahead of him. In Japan, he started second and finished sixth. He had an early collision with Max that caused Max to DNF, and then Charles had front wing damage and received a 5-second penalty for the collision, then a 10-second penalty for not pitting soon enough when he had damage, and he worked all the way back up to sixth after the damage, but was moved to seventh after the penalties. And when Daniel received a DSQ, he was brought back up to sixth. Mexico, another pole position for Charles, but after a two-stop strategy was not the correct way to go, he ended up finishing fourth. In Austin, he started fourth and finished fourth. According to Charles, just overall shit race, had no pace, so not much more they could do there. Again, in Brazil, he qualified fourth. The engine penalty relegated him down to 14th. He ended up working his way through the field, but trying to get a late pass on Vettel caused them both to DNF. You can blame Seb, you can blame Charles. That is not what this video is about. I will not be arguing that case because no one will be happy. In Abu Dhabi, Charles started third and finished third. He had a battle with Max during the race, but was suffering issues with DRS where it just wasn't opening in some cases. And then after the race, it was found out that both Charles and Seb had too much fuel in their car. So it resulted in a fine for Ferrari, not a DSQ, thank God. Moving into 2020, remember how I just said Ferrari got caught with too much fuel in their car? Yeah, so in 2019, Ferrari were found guilty of having an illegal engine, which was investigated after their surge in performance in Belgium. Mind you, there was no proof of this. No proof of the illegal engine was ever found. However, it seemed like they had found a trick or a gray area in which it allowed them to bypass a sensor and allow more fuel into their system. So in 2020, the FIA punished them by allowing them to run less fuel than the maximum, resulting in them losing a rumored 65 horsepower, leading them to finish sixth in the standings. So yeah, this is going to be a much shorter section, not only due to the fact that it was COVID, so we had way less races, but also because Ferrari were just dog shit. Absolute dog shit this year. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. We were lucky to score points. Despite what was happening at Ferrari, this was actually a pretty good year for Charles Leclerc and actually really showed where he shined against Seb. He out-qualified him 13-7, averaging 4/10 a lap faster during qualifying. He was also able to reach Q3 11 times compared to Seb's 3. He somehow was able to finish second in the season opener and third in Silverstone, contributing to 2 out of the 3 podiums that Ferrari got this year. He then suffered a power unit failure in Spain, and just straight up lack of pace in Spa and Monza meant they were absolutely nowhere. There was no Monaco this year, so no Monaco curse, I guess. Somehow in Portugal, he was able to reach Q3 on medium tires. Okay. And then ended up qualifying P4. He had some good battles this year. Overall, just kind of a rough time for Ferrari and in turn all Ferrari-powered cars because they all received the same punishment. Charles also faced an absolute depression of Sebastian leaving the team this year when he announced it at Ferrari's 1000 GP celebration weekend, after it was announced that Charles Leclerc would be getting the longest contract extension in Ferrari history. It was pretty sad to see Seb and Charles' relationship go. They seem to have a pretty good bond. A lot of what Charles learned through Seb, he still carries with him. Every time you see him carrying around that little notebook, know it is because of Seb. And now I shall show you the helmet that Sebastian Vettel left for Charles Leclerc, in which he claims he is the most talented driver that he has seen in 15 years, and not to waste it. Yeah, I'm not crying, you are. 2021 saw a new teammate for Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, and it was also the start of all of the bad luck that Charles would seem to face for the rest of his career. In Bahrain, he started 4th, finished 6th. In Imola, he started 4th, finished 4th. He was in 2nd with a 26 gap on Lando in 3rd. However, due to a safety car with a Bottas and George crash, it allowed Hamilton to get back to 1st and drop Charles to 4th. Portugal, again, another 6th place finish. In the Spanish GP, he started and finished 4th, and now only him, Max, and Lewis have kept in the top 6 for the first 5 races. And now it is time for everybody's favorite, Charles Leclerc's home race. And of course, what happens in qualifying? We are on pole, baby. Surely nothing can go wrong. Everybody wins Monaco from pole. Like, nothing could go wrong. However, in Q3, Charles Leclerc did crash his car, which ended up ending qualifying early, and they were worried about fixing his car for the race. And they did fix his car for the race. However, on the formation lap, oh no, something's broken. Yeah, so when Charles went into the wall and hit the right side of his car, Ferrari decided, oh, so we only have to check the right side of his car, and failed to check the left side of his car. So his left drive shaft was actually broken, and they did not fix it before the race, meaning he didn't even start the Monaco Grand Prix. So starting on pole, Tua did not start. Oh, Monaco. Baku, we had another Charles Leclerc pole masterclass. Who would have guessed this would happen in Baku? However, he ended up finishing 4th because he had to avoid a fallen branch. He does claim this is his best pole around Baku because the car was absolutely nowhere at the time. In France, he started 7th and finished 16th. At the Styrian Grand Prix, he finished 7th and was voted driver of the day after a great comeback drive. The Austrian GP, we saw him finish 8th after an incident with Perez, who pushed him off wide twice. Silverstone, he led the race for 49 laps, but ended up only finishing 2nd due to his engine cutting out on him. I mean, literally, can anything ever go right for him? I want to know. But Hamilton's dad did have some very nice things to say about Charles after the race, and I'm excited for these two as teammates. Like, I'm really not gonna lie to you.
Yeah, I think it's worth an honorary mention for Charles Leclerc as well. He had a hell of a Grand Prix.
Unbelievable. Absolutely
Amazing.
unbelievable. But you see, the other thing also with Charles, he's a huge gentleman. He's such a gentleman,
yeah,
you know, and yeah, you know, it's going to be his time.
Hungary saw Charles start 7th in DNF due to Stroll going bowling for some reason. Belgium, he went out in Q2 but was able to make his way back up to 8th during the race. Zandvoort, he started and finished 5th. Monza finished 4th. Russia had a grid penalty, qualified 15th, which is where he finished the race. However, it was just actually a bad race from Charles. Like, genuinely his worst race that season. Turkish GP saw Charles finish 4th. US GP finished 4th. Brazil finished 5th. Qatar qualified 13th and finished 8th. In Saudi, he finished 8th. In Abu Dhabi, he finished 10th. Arguably, this was one of his worst seasons in F1, but it was plagued by a lot of misfortune. And he finished the season behind Carlos, which is the only time he's ever finished the season behind the teammate. It also caused a lot of rumors that Carlos Sainz is a lot better than Charles Leclerc. However, this would be quickly disproven come 2022. 2022 would mark a new era in Formula One with a new regulation cycle coming out, leaning more into ground effects than the engine. After preseason testing, Charles seemed to have a lot of hope for this car, even posting, "I can't wait to drive this beast," claiming a love letter, essentially to SF75, claiming it was like seeing a girl or guy that you have a crush on for the first time. Everybody is excited for this. Ferrari looks fast, and so do the Red Bulls. Maybe we can get a title fight. Let me just tell you, I would genuinely do anything to feel the joy and excitement I had during the beginning half of this season again. In Bahrain, Charles takes pole and fighting Max for most of the race. Charles came out victorious, and it was a Ferrari 1-2 after both Red Bulls DNF'd. In Saudi Arabia, Charles was starting 2nd behind Perez. However, his real battle this race was with Max for 1st, and they were 9 seconds ahead of Sainz in 3rd. And after a very exciting battle, Charles finished 5/10 behind Max. And you can even hear his excitement post-race on his radio messages.
Well done to Max. That was nice.
Australia, which has been deemed as Charles Leclerc's worst track over the years, is also seemingly the only race he has a Grand Slam at. On Saturday, he took pole, and on Sunday, he took the win, fastest lap, and led every lap, finishing the race 20 seconds ahead of Perez in 2nd. He had asked to pit at one point for new soft tires to get the fastest lap, but had already had the fastest lap. Another DNF for Max meant that Charles is now 34 points ahead of him in the championship. In Imola, Charles qualified P2 for the sprint and led for a little bit, but tire dig was too much, led to him driving back to 2nd, where he would ultimately start the race. They really had no pace match for the Red Bull here, and P3 was the best they could have done. However, Charles still trying to push into his own demise, causing a spin, ending up P6 instead. Charles started the next race in Miami on pole due to Max making a mistake. However, Charles ended up coming second to Max due to just lacking pace and struggling with tire dig, and overall the Ferrari was just not good in slow speed corners. In Spain, Charles had a spin on his first run on his Q3 lap, but came around on the second run just to put 4/10 on Sainz for pole position. It was looking like a very dominant win for him, gaining almost 30 seconds on the lead before his pit stop was then ripped away on lap 27 with a power unit failure. Monaco, surely it has to be our year. Another pole position. What can go wrong? Everybody wins Monaco from pole. Seriously? It has to be our time this year. It was not our time this year. It was mixed conditions on race day, and when the track started to dry up, they accidentally called both him and Sainz into the pits at the same time, causing Charles to get stuck behind Sainz for his pit stop, ultimately making him drop to P4 off the podium for his home race after starting on pole.
Box now, box now, box for hard. Stay out, stay out. Tire, position 5.
Baku, and would you look at that? Oh yeah, another pole position for Charles Leclerc. I sure hope nothing goes wrong this time. Oh, what's that? What's that? Oh, his engine blew up. Good. No, that sounds about right. Yeah, no, perfect. In Canada, now faced with a grid penalty for a new engine, Charles is starting P20 and somehow recovered to a P5, so imagine where he would have been with no engine penalty. Silverstone can be perfectly wrapped up by the quote, "Ferrari have won, but with the wrong driver." Charles starting P2 behind Carlos, but this did not matter because Charles ended up leading the race even after front wing damage and was on average 3/10 faster than Sainz per lap. This was until a late safety car when Ferrari seemingly believed it was a good idea to not pit Charles for softs, and now the 3 cars behind him all have new soft tires. He ends up losing the lead to Sainz because of this, and after a masterclass of defense against Perez and Lewis, he's still no match on old hard tires and ends up 4th. In Austria, Charles started P2 and finished P2 for the sprint, but seemed super hopeful for the pace they had on Sunday, claiming that they had got them, that they were going to get the Red Bulls on the Sunday. And get the Red Bulls on a Sunday they did. The race saw Charles and Max swapping lead on multiple occasions, and he ended up victorious, taking only his 3rd win of the season, with Max just over a second behind. In France, he took a beautiful pole position, but after a mistake, he spun, hitting the wall, losing what would have been a convincing win. This and Imola, I truly believe, were his only mistakes this season. In Hungary, Charles started the race P3, but his race was destroyed by strategy, even after knowing that the hard tires weren't good because all the teams were reporting struggles all day. Ferrari still put Charles on hards, causing him to drop to P6. In Spa, he qualified 4th, but was starting 15th due to penalties alongside Max in 14th. Max went on to win this race, and Charles ended up P6. He finished 74 seconds behind Max after a tear-off got stuck in his brake duct, which also meant that he couldn't slow down enough in the pits, granting him a 5-second penalty. In Zandvoort, Charles finished 3rd when he really should have been 2nd, but due to him pinning before the VSC that gave everyone else a free pit stop, he lost a place. In Monza, Ferrari's last upgrades were still not enough to catch the Red Bulls this season, and after taking pole, was only able to finish 2nd behind Max. Singapore saw another pole position for Charles since Max had to abort his lap due to low fuel. Charles finished 2nd behind Checo, who would have received a penalty for exceeding the 10 lengths under a safety car twice, but nothing happened. In Japan, more degradation problems for Ferrari. Charles struggled to fend off the Red Bulls driving his car on ropes. The race was finished early due to rain, and Max was crowned champion due to his points gap. Austin time, and can you guess what? Another 10-place grid penalty. So starting P12 but fighting back to P3 after struggling with tire dig for nearly the entire race. Mexico saw Charles finish nearly a minute behind Max in 6th place as Ferrari was struggling hardcore this weekend. Now, Brazil this year is one that I have a very much love-hate relationship with. The crimes that Ferrari committed on Charles Leclerc during qualifying should go down in the history books, because when it's the start of Q3 and there's rumored rain to be had, but not really any rain falling right now, Ferrari decided to make the brave decision to put Charles Leclerc on intermediates, and when waiting for that green light, Charles Leclerc, as the first car, looks in his mirrors and go, is everybody else on slicks? And guess what? Everybody else is on slicks. So now everyone is setting their lap times on this first laps because the rain is coming, but it's still fine for them to use their slicks. So by the time Charles Leclerc is able to come in to transfer for slicks, it is now too wet on the track for those slicks to be useful. Yeah. So, qualifying P10. This led to a very, very angry Charles, in which we have some of my favorite photos of him. Like, this man is yelling. He was ready to commit crimes that day, and honestly, I do not blame him. The start of the race did not go much better for Charles, getting clipped by Lando and ending up in the wall. For only a quick second, he was able to pull himself out of it and make an amazing comeback drive to P4 somehow, which is why I kind of love this race. But Lando, you will also pay for your crimes. Also, quick shout out to Max for being an absolute menace during this race and not swapping back positions with his teammate, leading to Charles and Perez being equal on points going into the final round of the year for P2. In Abu Dhabi, being even on points with Checo for P2, we were able to make a one-stop strategy work and ended up finishing P2 in the race ahead of Checo, making us rightful second place in the championship. The 2023 season for Charles Leclerc and Ferrari can ultimately be summed up by the one upside-down smiley face emoji that Charles Leclerc used when describing the car after preseason testing. It was not a good one. Given the way we started 2022, you would think that we would be able to improve on that car in 2023. And I mean, even though we had some pretty poor upgrades during the 2022 season, surely we figured this out for 2023, right? Well, the answer to that question would be no. Getting into race 1 of the season in Bahrain. Engine failure. It's going to be a long one. By Saudi Arabia, we have already somehow managed to go over the CE allocations and are faced with a 10th-place grid penalty in only the second race of the year, and we managed to finish 7th after starting 12th. But I mean, like, we truly had no pace. The Aston Martins, the Mercedes, and the Red Bulls are all faster than us at this point. On to Australia, our Grand Slam last year. Surely we should be good here. A poorly managed quality meant only one warm-up lap when everyone else did 2, so he only qualified P7, and he was quickly taken out by Stroll in lap 1 of the race. So, didn't matter anyway. But on to Baku, baby, and guess what? We are back on pole. If there is one thing Charles Leclerc is going to do, it is get pole in Baku. But remember how I said the Ferrari have no pace this year? Yeah, the Red Bull had the exact opposite of that, and seemingly had all the pace in the world. Charles ended up P2 in the sprint and P3 in the race, and really he had no reason to be on that pole in the first place. Miami, Charles suffered another bad quali, ending up P7 after crashing on his second lap, and Ferrari severely lacked straight line speed here, so Charles ended up finishing the race also in 7th. In Spain, Charles qualified P19, and after they realized that Charles had the wrong setup, so they decided to start him from the pit lane to correct this, and on lap 41 of the race, they ignored his calls to put him back on new soft tires, and instead put him on a new set of hard tires, so he ended up P11 in what could have easily been a P8. In Monaco, Charles qualified P3, but due to his engineer's lack of communication and failing to tell him that there was a car on a fast lap behind him during qualifying, he got a penalty for impeding, starting and ending his race in P6. At least we're finishing the race now, you know? Like, how could I complain? In Canada, Ferrari were too late putting softs on Charles for quali, and he ended up locking up during his last lap, seeing him out in Q2 in P11. Unlike quali though, Ferrari actually made a good strategy call for the race, and Charles ended up P4. The sprint in Austria saw difficult conditions, and struggling with understeer, Charles qualified P6, but started P9, and then ended up being P12 by the end of the sprint. Better conditions for the race saw Charles qualify and finish P2. In Silverstone, he managed to qualify P4, but the car was still struggling with understeer. Ferrari decided on a 2-stop strategy for some reason during the race, so instead of a potential P3, he ends up P9. In Hungary, he qualified P6 and a 9.4 second stop saw him losing positions, and to make matters worse, he then had a penalty for speeding in the pit lane, ultimately ending up P7. In Belgium, Charles got P5 in the sprint, and after qualifying second for the race, he ended up finishing third after defending brilliantly against Hamilton. In Zandvoort, a crash in quali meant he was starting P9, and then had contact with Piastri during the first lap of the race, damaging his front end plate, which ended up getting stuck under his floor, costing him 2 seconds per lap. He correctly made the decision to pit for new inters on the end lap 1. However, Ferrari decided to not have tires ready for him, leading to a 20-second pit stop, and with the floor damage being so severe, it meant that he ended up retiring from the race anyway. We're in Monza, baby, back on Ferrari's home ground. No toe in quali meant that he missed out on pole by 600ths on Saturday, and because he missed free practice due to mechanical issues, he had to use Sainz's setup, which was not compatible with his style because Sainz prefers a more understeery car, while Charles prefers a more oversteery car. Even though Charles was faster than Sainz at the end of the race, Ferrari allowed them to fight, which almost caused a crash when Sainz moved under braking. However, Charles quickly diverted from this. Charles, however, did not seem too fazed by this. I mean, the man was quite literally giggling after the battle and went to check Fred's pulse, saying how much he enjoyed the battle. This is also honor to Egate. Honor Tweetgate is one of my favorites because what was Carlos Sainz's mom doing liking that tweet saying that Charles Leclerc has no honor, and Charles Leclerc liking a tweet back of him winning in Monza, and it just says honor. That's my petty king. Singapore was a shock this year because it was the only place where Red Bull really showed weakness, and because of this, Ferrari were able to secure a 1-3 starting grid with Sainz ahead. And instead of trying to finish 1-2, Ferrari wanted to secure the win. Starting Charles on soft meant he was able to jump George at the start, and then Ferrari came over the radio telling him to build a gap for Sainz, which led to George's radio saying, "They're going to sacrifice Leclerc." Ferrari kept telling him to grow the gap more and more despite his protest of it ruining his race, then pitted him under the safety car, but after failing to release him at the proper time, he lost 2 places in the pit lane, and at the restart he lost another place to Hamilton, avoiding a crash in front of him. He ended up having overheating issues, so had to coast to avoid his engine blowing up and ended up P4 for the race. Japan was a pretty uneventful race for Charles and Ferrari. McLaren upgrades were strong. Charles started and ended P4. On to Qatar this year, and first of all, I just have to say, jail time for the race this year. Because what were they doing driving around in that heat? It should have been illegal. The amount of drivers that had to go to the medics afterwards and were quite literally passing out. As someone threw up in his helmet, Logan Sargent didn't even finish the race because he was so ill. I'm so glad it was fine for 2024, but truly 2023 was a mess. Anyways, Charles qualified P5 for the race and P7 for the sprint. He finished P in the sprint but received a 5-second penalty for track limits, one of which was his teammate running him wide, taking him out of the points. In the race, after a battle with Alonso, he ended up remaining in P5. Austin, a P2 in sprint quali, and by some miracle got pulled for the race. He finished P3, and after a controversial one-stop race when everyone else did a two-stop, he managed to finish P6. Probably would have been better with the two-stop strategy, but I guess that doesn't matter because he gets disqualified, along Lewis, for having a plank wear that was 0.01 millimeters over the limit. Mind you, only 4 cars were checked, and 2 of them had this issue. So, it leads me to believe that a lot of other cars would have been disqualified had they gone to check the rest of the grid. Mexico saw another pole position for Charles, and this triple header looked like it was turning itself around for us. At the start, Perez thought it would be a good idea to go 3 wide into turn 1, and Charles ended up being squeezed by both Max and Perez, with Perez colliding with Charles, leading to Perez's DNF. He was on course to finish P2, but after a late restart, the hard tires would not warm back up for him, and he ended up P3, getting severely booed by the home crowd for something that simply was not his fault. In Brazil, he qualified P7 for the sprint on used tires and finished the sprint P5. For the race, he had a brilliant qualifying during the wet conditions and ended up P2, meaning there was a good chance for big points. However, on the formation lap, we saw him go spinning into the wall, and all I hear over my radio is, "Why the fuck am I so unlucky?" And then I start crying. Turns out, hydraulic failure. Yeah. The triple header did not turn itself around for us. In Vegas, Charles took another brilliant pole, and this track was great for Ferrari because it was so cold that it would offset their tire dig and overheating issues that they've been having all season. Max ran him wide in the race and received a 5-second penalty, but there was a real battle happening between Charles and Max, and we saw someone actually pass Max on pure pace for what seemed like the first time this season. And unfortunately, a safety car meant that Max was able to pit for new hards, and Charles was struggling to reheat his old ones after the restart. Charles ended up being passed by both Red Bulls, but on the last lap, on the last corner, made a huge dive bomb on Checo to take P2. It should have been a win, but unfortunate timing for a safety car. In Abu Dhabi, Charles qualified P2 and somehow held on to that during the race, despite pressure from both Checo and George. He also showed a brilliant strategy in trying to get Ferrari P2 in the Constructors' Championship by letting Checo pass because he knew that Checo had a 5-second penalty, so Charles would keep the place behind, but if George were to finish below Checo, Ferrari would secure the P2. This didn't end up working, but it was a good idea. Overall, despite this being a terrible year for Ferrari and reliability for Charles, he still managed to finish above Sainz and equal on points for P4 in the championship, and his insane quality run at the end cannot go unnoticed. Big hopes for 2024. Come 2024, and Ferrari are looking like the clear second fastest car behind Red Bull. However, the first race of the year already saw problems for Charles. After qualifying P3 behind the Red Bulls, we see Charles micro-locking almost every turn that he is making during the first few laps of the race. Nobody really knew what was going on with Charles at this point, which if anyone decided to turn on his radio during the race, they would have found out that there was a 100-degree temperature difference between his 2 brakes. To which Charles said after the race, "I think on the radio the team told me that it was a 100-degree more split between the front and left." and that stayed for the whole race. So we were in a very, very bad place, and it was like this. Overall, 2024 was not starting out on a great note for us. Now, also, because of this issue in Bahrain, Carlos Sainz was able to finish ahead of him, and the first article written of the year was basically just saying that Ferrari fired the wrong driver. They should have kept Carlos Sainz and they should have fired Charles Leclerc because of one race where Charles Leclerc was having brake issues, and he still somehow managed to finish P4. I digress. In Saudi Arabia, Carlos Sainz is out with appendicitis, bringing in Ollie Behrman as Charles Leclerc's teammate. Charles was able to qualify P2 and finish the race in third, as the Red Bulls just simply had too much speed still at this point. In Australia, he was slower than Sainz for most of the weekend. I mean, it really just not a great track for him. Like, I still don't know how he got a Grand Slam here. And a max DNF meant that him and Carlos would have a 1-2 finish with Charles second. Japan saw a tire masterclass from Charles. He qualified P8 and finished P4 after taking a risk with a one-stop strategy and managing his tires beautifully. In China for the sprint, he started 7th and finished 4th. In the race, he started 6th and finished 4th. Again, starting to see signs of issues with the SF24 in qualifying and a McLaren resurgence. The sprint saw some controversy between Charles and Carlos because despite Charles being clearly quicker, Ferrari didn't intervene, and instead we saw a pretty intense battle with Carlos, where Carlos ended up making contact with Charles and forcing him entirely off the track, with Charles at the end saying it was over the limit and they had to look into it because Carlos is always fighting him harder than others. In Miami, he missed the only free practice session, losing traction on a turn, and went straight to sprint qualifying, getting P2, which he was able to maintain for the end of the sprint. He started P2 in the race, but dropped behind Oscar because he just simply didn't have the pace, but a good strategy with an undercut put Charles back ahead of Oscar, and after a safety car that allowed Lando to take the lead of the race, he dropped back to third behind Max in second. In Imola, Ferrari controversially introduced a new race engineer for Charles, and we were all scared, to say the least, because I mean, we've had Xavi for years. He was not great, but we've had him for years. And now the race before Monaco, we are entering a new engineer. But I mean, nothing can be worse than Xavi, so fuck it, we ball. He ended up qualifying P4, but moved to P3 as Oscar received a penalty. He also finished the race in P3, but the big talking point was that Lando was nearly catching Max at the end of this race, really showing that McLaren had a lot of pace behind them. Back to Monaco, baby, and after years and years of strife, all I'm hoping is for just one good thing for us. He was a mile above the rest of the grid this entire weekend, qualifying on pole pretty comprehensively, and now we just have to hope that Lady Luck is on our side. But the moon is red and we've actually made a good car this year. What can go wrong? I'll tell you what. Nothing. An early crash in lap 1 saw a red flag put out, meaning that despite Carlos's lockup that should have brought him into P16, he'll retain his P3. This also means that everyone will get a free tire change, so no pit stops during the race, and I don't care if you thought this race was boring. My heart rate didn't drop below 150 for the entire 3 hours, and I just knew I was going to love Brian for the rest of my life after that radio message.
The grandstands he saw built as a kid growing up now rise for him, and for the first time in 93 years, this fabled race is won by one of their own. Charles Leclerc wins the Monaco Grand Prix to achieve his dream. Victory in his home race. Well done, Charles Leclerc. It's mission accomplished, destiny fulfilled. You've got that one forever.
Riding off the high of Monaco, I thought Ferrari is back in this baby. We are 28 points off that championship lead. Charles is looking in the hunt to be in a title fight right now. What could go wrong? Well, I'll tell you what. In Canada, everything could go wrong. It looked like we sold our soul to the devil to get that Monaco win. I mean, I wasn't that mad, but I was a little bit mad because it meant the rest of the season was going to be shit. In Canada, both cars were on Q2 because they were set up for rain, and it did not rain, so it was an unlucky gamble for Ferrari. Charles was reporting issues with his car from the start, and on lap 28, Charles pit and they did a full electronic restart on his car, which took 47 seconds, and when he left the pits, he got lapped. Ferrari gambled to go early on hards and make up positions, but it started raining, so Charles is now on slicks in the wet. They ended up retiring the car because mixed conditions were not worth the risk when you're already last and running a lap down. In Spain, Ferrari had speed run their upgrades, bringing them in a few races early, which was boo. Not good, not good. Charles started and finished the race in 5th, but it was another crack in Charles and Carlos, with Carlos clearly not following a team strategy, who wanted to save tires in the beginning to try and overtake the Mercedes, who were on used tires while they were on new tires. Carlos instead attacked Charles lap 3, pushed him off track, and did not try to push to overtake the Mercedes at all. And because Carlos had to pit so early, they had to avoid a 3-stop strategy and put him on hards at the end. And on lap 55, when Charles took a second stop for new softs, he re-overtook Carlos, which caused Charles, after the race, to say maybe he wanted to try something impressive in front of his home crowd. And let me tell you what, the crowd was gagged. In Austria, Charles made a mistake during qualifying, tried to push too hard, and ended up P6, but ultimately his race was determined when he got squeezed by Oscar and Checo, where he made contact with Oscar and Charles had damage to his front wing, so he came in for a front wing change. In the end, he ended up having 4 pit stops, finishing P11. Silverstone was another shit show. Someone needs to tell the Ferrari pit wall how to communicate, please. Charles started P11 and finished P14. On lap 20, Charles was told heavy rain was imminent, so he came in for intermediates, but oh God, would you look at that? No one else did that because there was only a slight chance of rain. And when the rain eventually did come, Charles had to re-pit for new intermediates because his were absolutely destroyed. Hungary was where we saw a slight resurgence in Ferrari. He qualified P6 and finished P4, another great tire masterclass for Charles. He got 30 laps on the mediums and overall was a pretty uneventful race. In Spa, a wet quali saw him get P2, but due to Max's grid penalty, we saw him bumped up to P1, and what was now the 4th fastest car, and the McLaren's and Mercedes clearly faster this weekend. In the end, he was able to hold off Lando and Max for 4th, which then became P3 after George was disqualified from P1. The race in Zandvoort can be described as we are going to need a miracle, and Charles Leclerc, you are that miracle. Starting P6, Charles was not expecting much, and somehow fought his way past Perez and Oscar, keeping the McLaren rocket ships behind him for a P3. In Monza, Charles only ended up qualifying P4, and it was not looking very hopeful for Ferrari, but it is their home race, and they will do anything to win. Jumping George to the start and benefiting from Oscar and Lando battling, he was also able to overtake Lando, placing him P2 by the end of lap 1. Charles was able to keep Lando behind until the first round of pit stops when he was undercut by Lando. McLaren were facing more date than Charles, and Lando ended up pinning again, bringing Charles back to second, but on very used tires, and was looking like a 2-stop race. With 15 laps left, Oscar pit from the lead, and Charles decided to stick to a 1-stop strategy. And due to some of the best tire management I've ever seen, Charles won the Grand Prix after starting 4th by 2.7 seconds. His lap times were genuinely insane, and somehow his lap times on lap 38 on those medium tires were just as good as his first few laps on them. Baku again saw Charles Leclerc absolutely outclassifying the field on a Saturday, but the McLarens were really strong on the straights. Charles was leading the race, but after the first pit stops, with Charles still warming up his tires, he made what I would consider to be his one true mistake this season, and that was leave the door open for Oscar, who ended up overtaking him. Charles was able to hang on to the back of him, but could never quite catch him on the straights, even with DRS. Surely no illegal activity was going on over there. But following Oscar this closely destroyed his tires, and Checo in third was quickly catching him along with his teammate. Checo and Carlos ended up starting to battle. Carlos overtook Checo and guns for Charles next, ultimately does not make it and instead crashes with Checo 2 seconds later. Charles finishes P2. Singapore and Ferrari are still facing their same issues of tire warm-up and quali, which meant that Charles was only able to get a P7 after Carlos crashed, but his lap time was deleted, so he's starting 9th. He was able to crawl back into 5th during the race. It was a pretty mixed weekend, but he definitely had the pace for better. Everything just went wrong in qualifying. Moving on to Austin, my race, baby. Okay, I was there. I witnessed it live and in person. And let me tell you, one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. Like, I would do anything to go back next year. I will do anything to go to more Grand Prix next year, actually. Charles qualified 3rd in the sprint, but lost places to both Carlos and Lando and ended up 4th. Again, another controversial sprint with Carlos, who, if they worked together, probably could have both gone ahead of Lando, but that was to no avail. He was starting P4 for the race, but still seemed pretty happy with the race pace that Ferrari seemed to have. But imagine my shock when I'm sat at turn 2 in the grass with my friends around me and a bunch of McLaren fans. I'm surrounded at this point in my Charles Leclerc jersey. And I hear over the radio that a Ferrari has overtaken somebody, but I'm not really processing it because it's loud. And all I see are cars go past me, and I see a red car in front. And I'm thinking, oh, Carlos Sainz, surely he started 3rd. He jumped Lando and Max at the start. It is Charles Leclerc. I quite literally fell to my knees. I fell to my knees. And then after every lap I saw him go by, this is what I was doing. And I felt at that point that if I didn't keep on doing that, he was going to lose the race. So I kept on doing it every race. My friends probably thought I was crazy, but I thought I was going to jinx him if I didn't keep on doing it. He went on to win this race pretty comprehensively, and Yeah, I love him down bad. I did see the podium live with my own two eyes. In Mexico, Charles was slower than Sainz all weekend, starting P4 again, but was able to capitalize off the Max and Lando fight, moving into P2. Was basically told to lift and coast the whole race, with Sainz complaining anytime he got anywhere close to him, but now with cold tires, Charles went wide in the last minute and lost place to Lando, ending up P3. On to Brazil, and this weekend was a whole mess. Not for Ferrari specifically, for the whole grid in general. Charles qualified P3 in the sprint, ahead of Max Verstappen, who, for some reason during the race, I hear the commentators going, Max Verstappen is encouraging an old rival along. He finished P3 ahead of Max because guess what, Max? You guys both made the same mistake. So fuck you for being like, Charles is making so many mistakes in front of me when you go on to make the same mistake. I don't want to hear it. Race qualifying ended up being delayed until Sunday morning because of the rain, and honestly, it was still raining Sunday morning. And after 4 red flags during qualifying, one caused by his own teammate, he qualified P6 as all of his laps were compromised by a red or yellow flag in Q3. The race was just messy. He was the only one able to hold off a charging Max Verstappen because he's actually really decent, and he pit before the safety car on red flag, which gave Max and the Alpines, who stayed out a free pit stop. In the end, Charles ended up P5 behind Russell. Ferraris have generally just struggled in the wet all year this year. No pace in the wet. Now, I was nervous for Vegas with Ferrari having the exact opposite problem that they did last year, which was they were now not heating up their tires at all when they were known for being able to overheat their tires. So going into a race that's cold and not being able to heat your tires up at all seems like the recipe for a disaster. He qualified P4 behind Sainz, but was able to jump him at the start of the race. The second round of pit stops had Charles coming out right next to Carlos, who was told not to make things difficult for him, but Charles was told that Sainz wouldn't pass him, causing Charles to say, maybe you should try in Spanish. He ended up P4 behind Carlos in the race, and it seems like Sainz did not stick to an agreed upon plan, and we finally saw Charles snap.
Carlos has been told to not overtake, but it's really close. He might be just in front. He has been told to not put you under pressure.
Maybe try in Spanish.
Pick up, please.
Yes, whatever you want, as always.
Charles, you did your job. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I did my job, but being nice over all the fucking time. It's not even being nice, it's just being respectful. I know I need to shut up, but at one point it's always the same, so... Oh my fucking god.
Okay, but anyway, you did the right thing for the team.
In Qatar, Charles got P5 in sprint quali and the sprint, so how he ended up P2 after qualifying P5 for the race, I truly have no idea. He was battling Oscar for most of the race for P3, and when a yellow flag came out that Lando ignored, giving him a 10-second stop and go penalty, Charles moved up to P2, keeping Oscar behind him somehow. Abu Dhabi saw a free practice 1 session with his brother that was interrupted because, you know, remember how Charles had that issue in the first race? Yeah, so they changed his battery after that first race, and apparently, his car was on critical levels for the past few races, and it decided to completely quit on him before FP1. And you're only allowed 2 for the season. So now Charles Leclerc is facing a 10-place grid penalty going into the final race of the year when there is a constructor's title on the line. In Q3, Charles Leclerc's lap time is deleted, meaning he will start P19 on a track not known for its overtaking abilities. Charles is one of the best starts I've ever seen, gaining 11 places in 1 lap and capitalizing on some lap 1 drama. Now P8, he's able to pick his way back up to P3, maximizing results, but there was a possibility for more without the penalty or deleted lap. The P2, P3 was also not enough to give Ferrari the constructor's title. Overall, I think 2024 was Charles Leclerc's most complete season as a driver. We really saw him come together to just be strong on all ends and really not have a lot of those same mistakes that he was having. And he even talked about this at the end of the year, where a lot of the times in the previous seasons he tried to outdrive the car, to push the car too far on its limits, to try to get more out of it than he could have, but he seemed to be able to find those limits a lot more this year and not want to push over them as many times as he used to, meaning that he was still able to maximize results and not taking the risk of crashing out of a race, even if it meant getting 1 place higher. The end of the season, however, has led me to be on such a delusional amount of hopium for Charles Leclerc and his championship chance next year. Like, someone actually has to inject me with something to take me down for this, because every day I wake up thinking about it. I wake up thinking about the fact that there's a really high chance that Charles has a chance of winning it this year, even with Lewis as his teammate. I'm on a full-on hopium of a Ferrari 1-2, constructor's title and everything. You can tell me that the McLarens are the favorite to win this. In my head of heads, it is the Ferrari. And that scares me, because I feel like I'm just setting myself up for such disappointment, but I cannot bring myself down from where I am right now. Well, anyways, that's it. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and also you can find me on all my other social medias here. I mainly post on TikTok. I am praying right now that it doesn't get banned. If not, I will probably be moving like all of my posts over onto here. I know it's going to be a weird format switch for me, but I do enjoy doing this. It does take me a lot more time, so you guys won't be getting videos like 3 or 4 times a day. You'll be getting them more of like once a week. My next planned video is to do a deep dive into F1 romance novels, because as a reader and F1 girly, it only feels right for me. But if you guys enjoy more things like this, I am more than happy to do them again. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.